There is a version of the Vietnam War that was taught in classrooms, debated in congressional hearings, and eventually folded into the national mythology of American sacrifice and political failure. That version is incomplete, not because the facts were wrong, but because the facts that were allowed to surface were selected with intention. The documents that remained sealed, the operations that were never acknowledged, the decisions made inside rooms where no journalist ever sat, those are the coordinates of a different map entirely. And that map leads somewhere most official histories refuse to go. The Vietnam War did not begin with the Gulf of Tonkin. It did not begin with advisors in the early 1960s. In the institutional memory of the American national security apparatus, it began the moment the French position in Indochina started to collapse, and American planners looked at Southeast Asia and understood that the region was about to become a laboratory for something they had no adequate name for yet. Not conventional war, not nuclear deterrence, something in between, something that would require new tools, new doctrines, and a new tolerance for ambiguity. What followed was not simply a war. It was an experiment conducted at scale on a population that had not consented to being experimented upon by a government that told its own citizens one story while writing a completely different one in classified cables and operational reports. The gap between those two stories is what this narration is about. The first thing to understand is that the Pentagon Papers, the documents that Daniel Ellsberg leaked to the New York Times in 1971, were not the full picture. They were a significant piece of it. But the papers themselves were an internal study commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and they covered a specific period and a specific institutional perspective. What they did not cover, what they could not cover, because the information was compartmentalized even within the Pentagon itself, was the full scope of covert operations, the true casualty accounting methods, the chemical and biological programs, the psychological operations run against American citizens as well as Vietnamese ones, and the back-channel negotiations that were deliberately sabotaged to keep the war running. Understanding that the Pentagon Papers were themselves a curated disclosure, not a complete one, is the starting point. Because if a study that shocked the nation and triggered a constitutional crisis was only a partial accounting, then the full accounting, the one that has never been assembled in a single place, is something that most people alive today have never seen and may never see. The war in Vietnam was preceded by a sustained campaign of covert action that began in the early 1950s, when the CIA and the Pentagon jointly ran operations inside North Vietnam, designed to destabilize the government of Ho Chi Minh before any American boots were officially on the ground. These operations, some of which were later described in the Church Committee hearings of the mid-1970s, involved the insertion of agents who were captured almost immediately, the dropping of psychological warfare materials, the sabotage of infrastructure, and the training of paramilitary units from Vietnamese nationalist factions who had no particular loyalty to any side, but were offered money, weapons, and the implicit promise of American backing. Most of these operations failed. The agents were captured, turned, or executed. The sabotage was repaired. The psychological materials were largely ineffective. But the institutional habit of covert action had been established, and what had failed at the tactical level was considered a strategic template that simply needed refinement. This is a pattern that recurs throughout the entire arc of American involvement in Vietnam. The lesson drawn from failure was rarely that the approach was wrong. The lesson drawn was almost always that more resources, better technology, greater secrecy, or more aggressive execution would produce different results. That habit of institutional self-justification is one of the structural features of the Vietnam War that the Pentagon tried hardest to conceal, because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging that decisions were being made on the basis of bureaucratic momentum rather than strategic logic. And acknowledging that would have collapsed the entire justification for the war from the inside. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August of 1964 is the most famous manufactured escalation in American military history. though it was not the only one, and arguably not even the most consequential. What happened in the Gulf of Tonkin was this. On August 2nd, 1964, North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked the USS Maddox, an American destroyer conducting electronic surveillance in the Gulf. That attack was real, though the full context of what the Maddox was doing in those waters and what American-backed South Vietnamese commandos had been doing in the same area in the days prior was withheld from Congress and the public. 2 days later, on August 4th, the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, reported a second attack. That second attack almost certainly did not happen. The reports were based on confused radar contacts, tense sailors firing at shadows in rough water at night, and the institutional pressure on commanders to confirm what Washington wanted confirmed. President Lyndon Johnson knew within hours that the second attack was questionable. The commander of the Maddox himself, Captain John Herrick, sent a cable to Washington saying that many of the reported contacts and torpedoes fired appeared doubtful, and that a complete evaluation was needed before any further action. That cable was received. It was read. And then Johnson went on national television and announced that American ships had been attacked and that a military response was being ordered. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave the president authority to conduct military operations in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war, passed the Senate with only 2 dissenting votes. It was based substantially on an incident that did not occur, and the people who authorized that resolution were not given the cable expressing doubt. They were not told about the prior South Vietnamese commando operations that had provoked the region. They were told what the administration wanted them to believe, and they voted accordingly. This is not a controversial interpretation. The National Security Agency's own declassified history of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, released in 2005, concluded that the signals intelligence did not support the conclusion that a second attack had occurred on August 4th. The NSA's historian wrote that the intelligence was deliberately skewed to support the claim of an attack. This document existed for decades before it was released. It sat in classified archives while veterans argued about the war, while historians wrote their books, while the men who made those decisions died of old age, having never been formally held to account. The structure of what followed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was not simply an escalation of military force. It was the construction of a parallel institutional reality. The official war, the one reported in press briefings and congressional testimony, was described in terms of progress, body counts, and strategic objectives. The actual war, the one documented in classified cables and operational reports and field assessments that contradicted almost every public statement being made, was understood internally to be going badly from almost the beginning. The body count metric deserves particular attention because it became the central mechanism of institutional deception, not simply deception of the public, but self-deception within the military itself. The logic of the body count was this. Since the United States could not measure territorial control, since the enemy had no fixed installations to destroy and no cities to capture, since the conventional metrics of military success did not apply, the metric would be enemy dead. The number of enemy soldiers killed would demonstrate progress. High body counts would mean the attrition strategy was working, that the enemy was being degraded faster than it could be replenished, that the end was approaching. The problem was that the body count was essentially a social construction. Field commanders who reported high body counts received positive evaluations. Field commanders who reported low body counts were questioned, their aggressiveness doubted, their careers implicitly threatened. The institutional incentive was not to report accurately, it was to report favorably, and so the numbers grew, and the numbers were believed by people who wanted to believe them, and the people who knew the numbers were false either fell silent or were removed from positions where their honesty was inconvenient. The actual casualty figures for North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, to the extent that they can be reconstructed, suggest that the official body counts were inflated by a factor of somewhere between 2 and 5, depending on the operation and the unit. Civilians killed in military operations were regularly counted as enemy combatants. People found near weapons were counted as enemy fighters. The institutional standard was, in the blunt language of many field officers, if it's dead and it's Vietnamese, it counts. That phrase appears in multiple after-action reports and oral histories. It was not an aberration. It was a system. The My Lai massacre of March 1968, in which American soldiers killed between 300 and 500 Vietnamese civilians in a village in Quang Ngai province, is the most famous single instance of what that system produced. But My Lai was not reported as a massacre. It was reported initially as a successful operation against an enemy stronghold with a high body count. The initial report described a significant number of enemy killed in action. The civilians massacred at My Lai, the women, the children, the elderly were absorbed into that number. The massacre was covered up at every level of the chain of command for more than a year, until a soldier named Ron Riddenhauer, who had heard accounts of what happened from men who were there, wrote letters to Congress and the Pentagon demanding an investigation. The investigation that followed, the Peers Commission, found that the cover-up extended from the platoon level all the way up through division command. Officers who should have investigated were found to have failed to do so. Reports that should have triggered inquiries were filed and forgotten. The institutional reflex was not accountability. It was protection of the institution. Only one officer was convicted. Lieutenant William Calley, the platoon leader who ordered the killings, was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was subsequently granted clemency, placed under house arrest by President Nixon, and eventually released after serving approximately 3 years. The officers above him who ordered the operation into a designated free-fire zone, who received the after-action report, who participated in the cover-up, were not convicted of anything. The story of My Lai and what it represented about the war was actively suppressed for over a year by the military chain of command. When it finally emerged, the response from the Pentagon and the Nixon administration was not to acknowledge the systemic conditions that made it possible. It was to treat it as an isolated incident, a failure of individual moral judgment rather than the predictable output of an institutional system that had been running on false numbers and dehumanized categories for years. The Phoenix program represents a different order of institutional secrecy, one that was not an incident but a sustained operational architecture. Phoenix was a joint American and South Vietnamese program run from 1965 through 1972, formally organized in 1967 and 1968 under CIA direction, with the explicit mission of identifying and neutralizing the Viet Cong infrastructure. The language is bureaucratic and precise. Neutralizing meant one of 3 things: capture, defection, or death. In practice, the distinction between those 3 outcomes was not always carefully maintained. The Phoenix program operated through a network of provincial reconnaissance units, which were paramilitary teams trained by American advisors and given authority to operate throughout the South Vietnamese countryside with minimal oversight. These teams were given quotas. They were expected to neutralize a certain number of Viet Cong infrastructure members per month. The quota system created the same incentive structure as the body count. It was easier to kill a suspected sympathizer than to capture and process one. It was easier to count the dead than to establish evidentiary standards for detention. The CIA officer who ran Phoenix at its peak, William Colby, who later became Director of Central Intelligence, testified before Congress in 1971 that the program had neutralized approximately 20,000 Viet Cong infrastructure members, of whom approximately 28% had been killed. That testimony was given in a congressional hearing. It was part of the public record. But the actual numbers, as reconstructed by independent researchers and declassified documents, suggest that the kill figures were substantially higher, that the procedures for identifying Viet Cong infrastructure members were deeply flawed, and that a significant proportion of the people killed by Phoenix teams were not in fact members of the communist infrastructure, but were instead personal enemies, victims of false denunciations, or civilians who happened to be in the wrong place. The Phoenix program was not secret in the sense of being unknown. Its existence was reported by journalists and debated in Congress. What was secret was the operational detail, the specific procedures, the extent to which American advisors were personally involved in interrogations that resulted in death, and the degree to which the program had drifted from its stated intelligence-gathering mission into something that more closely resembled a systematic campaign of targeted assassination and extrajudicial killing. Former Phoenix participants gave testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and to various journalists describing techniques of interrogation that constituted torture under any definition. They described the use of the water method, electrical shock, and various forms of physical coercion against detainees who had not been charged with any crime and had no legal recourse. American advisors who were present during these interrogations and who raised objections were reassigned. American advisors who participated were given operational evaluations that noted their effectiveness. The CIA's institutional memory of Phoenix was carefully managed for decades afterward. The program was described in internal documents as having produced significant intelligence value and as having substantially degraded the Viet Cong infrastructure in many provinces. The independent assessments, including those from within the South Vietnamese government itself, were considerably more ambiguous. The South Vietnamese officials who ran their end of the program acknowledged privately that the intelligence baseline was poor, that many of the people killed or captured were not actually infrastructure members, and that the program had generated significant civilian animosity that counteracted its tactical gains. This pattern of an operation being described internally in terms of its tactical metrics, while the strategic counter-effects were systematically understated or ignored, is one of the consistent features of the Vietnam War's institutional history. The war generated data continuously, obsessively, in volumes that no previous conflict had approached. Computers were used to manage and analyze operational data. Statistics were compiled and compared and briefed at every level. And the data consistently said the war was going well, even as the actual situation on the ground was deteriorating, because the data was the product of a system that had been designed, through its incentive structures and its reporting conventions, to generate favorable data. The CORDS program, which stood for Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, was the broader counterinsurgency framework under which Phoenix operated. CORDS was run by a civilian, Robert Comer, who had a reputation within the bureaucracy for aggressive optimism and for producing metrics that demonstrated progress. The Hamlet evaluation system, which was developed under CORDS, assigned each of South Vietnam's roughly 12,000 hamlets a letter grade from A through E based on a series of criteria measuring security and government control. By 1971 and 1972, the Hamlet evaluation system was showing that the majority of South Vietnam's population lived in A and B rated hamlets, meaning hamlets that were considered secure and under government control. The people who built and maintained the Hamlet evaluation system knew it was unreliable. The data was collected by district advisors who frequently did not speak Vietnamese, who received their information from South Vietnamese district officials who had strong incentives to report favorable conditions, and who were evaluated in part on the security grades assigned to their districts. The system was measuring not the actual security of the hamlets, but the willingness of the people within the system to report favorable conditions. When the North Vietnamese Easter Offensive of 1972 swept through provinces that the Hamlet evaluation system had rated as substantially secure, the intellectual bankruptcy of the system was exposed. But by that point, the Americans who had built it were largely gone, and the accountability for what it had produced was as diffuse as everything else in the institutional history of the war. The air war over North Vietnam and Laos represents a dimension of the conflict that was hidden not simply through the management of information, but through the physical geography of where it was conducted. The bombing of Laos from 1964 through 1973 was, in terms of total tonnage dropped, the heaviest aerial bombardment in history. The United States dropped more bombs on Laos, a neutral country with a population of roughly 3 million people, than it dropped on all of Europe during the Second World War. This is a matter of established historical record. It was secret at the time, and it remained partially secret for years after the war ended. The bombing of Laos was conducted under an operational designation called Barrel Roll in the north of the country and Steel Tiger and Tiger Hound in the south. The missions were flown from bases in Thailand and from carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin. The pilots who flew them filed mission reports that described operations in Laos. Those reports were classified. The existence of the bombing was known to a small number of congressional leaders who had been briefed in closed session. It was not reported to the full Congress. It was not disclosed to the public. When journalists or congressional members asked about American military operations in Laos, they were told that the United States was not conducting bombing missions in Laos. This was a lie that was told with institutional consistency for years. The reason for the secrecy was that Laos was formally neutral under the Geneva Agreement of 1962, which both the United States and North Vietnam had signed. Acknowledging that the United States was conducting massive air operations over Laos would have meant acknowledging that it was violating an international agreement it had formally committed to in a country whose government it claimed to be protecting. The Laotian government of the time, the Royal Lao government, was aware of and had in fact requested some aspects of the American air support. But the scale and the nature of the operations went well beyond what had been authorized under any diplomatic framework, and acknowledging the full scope would have created political and legal complications that the Johnson and Nixon administrations were not prepared to manage. The human cost of the bombing of Laos has never been fully accounted for. The most commonly cited estimates suggest that somewhere between 50,000 and 300,000 Laotian civilians were killed as a result of American bombing, though the range of that estimate reflects the genuine difficulty of establishing reliable numbers in a country with limited infrastructure and record-keeping even before the bombing began. What is known precisely is that the unexploded ordnance left by the bombing continues to kill and maim Laotians today, more than 50 years after the last American aircraft left. The Lao government estimates that between 40 and 80 million unexploded cluster munitions remain in the soil of Laos, and that they continue to cause roughly 300 casualties per year, a number that has declined only slowly over decades of clearance work that has been chronically underfunded. The American government did not formally acknowledge the bombing of Laos until 1969, when Senate hearings forced a partial disclosure. Even then, the full scope of the operations was not disclosed. The pilots who flew the missions, the targeteers who planned them, the commanders who authorized them, and the officials who lied about them operated for years in a framework of institutional denial that was maintained with the full knowledge of senior officials in the executive branch. The secret war in Cambodia followed a similar pattern with a different political context. The bombing of Cambodia, known as Operation Menu, began in March of 1969, shortly after Richard Nixon took office. The targets were North Vietnamese supply routes and base areas in the Cambodian border region, the so-called sanctuary areas where North Vietnamese forces moved supplies and rested troops. The military had been requesting permission to bomb these areas since at least 1967. Johnson had refused. Nixon approved. The operational security around Menu was extraordinary, even by the standards of the secret war in Southeast Asia. The missions were flown with falsified flight logs. Pilots were given a secondary set of coordinates representing targets inside South Vietnam, which were the coordinates entered into official records. The actual targets, in Cambodia, were entered only into a separate classified reporting system maintained by a small number of individuals at the Strategic Air Command. When senators and journalists asked about American military operations in Cambodia, they were shown the falsified records. The people who maintained those records knew they were falsified. They had been ordered to maintain them by the chain of command. The falsification of the bombing records was not discovered until 1973, when Air Force Major Hal Knight, who had been responsible for maintaining the covert records at a B-52 base in Guam, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee that he had been ordered to destroy the secret records after the existence of the Cambodia bombing became public. Knight's testimony was one of the triggering events for the articles of impeachment drafted against Nixon, though the Cambodia bombing article was ultimately not included in the final impeachment charges. partly because some of the congressional members who would have had to vote on it had themselves been briefed about the bombing in closed session. The institutional process by which the Cambodia bombing was hidden from Congress and the public was not improvised. It was designed by a small number of senior military officers and White House officials who understood that they were conducting military operations against a neutral country in secret, and that the secrecy required active falsification of official records. The people who designed that process and the people who maintained it understood what they were doing. The record they left behind is one of deliberate institutional fraud conducted at the highest levels of the military and civilian command structure. The use of Agent Orange and other herbicide agents throughout the Vietnam War is a chapter of institutional denial that extended not only through the war itself, but for decades afterward, and that continues to have significant legal and medical dimensions today. The herbicide program, known as Operation Ranch Hand, sprayed approximately 19 million gallons of herbicides over approximately 30% of South Vietnam's land area between 1961 and 1971. The most heavily used agent was Agent Orange, a compound that contained significant levels of dioxin, specifically TCDD, which is one of the most toxic synthetic compounds known to science. The military's own records show that concerns about the health effects of the herbicides were raised internally as early as 1963, when the President's Science Advisory Committee studied the health effects of the defoliants being used. Those concerns were not communicated to the soldiers who handled and were exposed to the agents, to the South Vietnamese civilians who lived in areas that were sprayed, or to the Vietnamese and American veterans who began reporting unusual patterns of illness and cancer in the years after the war ended. The Dow Chemical Company, which was one of the principal manufacturers of Agent Orange, had internal documents from the early 1960s showing that its scientists understood that the dioxin contamination in their product was a significant health hazard. Those documents were not disclosed to the military purchasers of the product. Or if they were disclosed, they were not acted upon, and they were certainly not disclosed to the people who were exposed to the product in the field. The Department of Defense's position for years after the war ended was that there was insufficient evidence to establish a causal link between Agent Orange exposure and the health conditions being reported by veterans. This position was maintained while veterans' organizations compiled evidence, while epidemiological studies were conducted, and while the internal corporate and military documents that would have supported the veterans' claims remained classified or undisclosed. The Institute of Medicine, in a series of reports beginning in the 1990s, eventually established sufficient evidence of association between Agent Orange exposure and a range of conditions, including several forms of cancer, type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's disease, and ischemic heart disease. The Veterans Administration subsequently added those conditions to its presumptive service connection list, meaning that veterans who had served in areas where herbicides were used could receive benefits without having to prove individual exposure. That policy change came decades after the first veterans began reporting these conditions. The men who spent those decades being told there was no proven connection, the men who died waiting for the government to acknowledge what its own internal records suggested, are part of the history of the Vietnam War that the Pentagon managed with particular thoroughness. The Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange have received no comparable acknowledgement. The Vietnamese government's estimates of the number of people affected by dioxin contamination run into the millions, including people who were born after the war with severe birth defects attributed to dioxin exposure in their parents or in the contaminated environment they were born into. No compensation has been provided, no formal acknowledgement of responsibility has been made. The Agent Orange litigation in American courts was largely dismissed on the grounds that the chemical manufacturers could not be held liable for following government orders, a legal theory that resolved the corporate liability question while leaving the human question entirely unresolved. The story of American prisoners of war and those listed as missing in action became one of the most politically charged aspects of the war's legacy, and it is also one of the areas where institutional manipulation of information was most sustained and most consequential. The official accounting of American service members who were prisoners or missing at the end of the war, and the question of whether any prisoners were knowingly left behind in Southeast Asia, became the subject of extensive congressional investigation, most notably the Senate Select Committee on POW and MIA Affairs, which conducted its work from 1991 through 1993. The committee's investigation, one of the most comprehensive congressional inquiries into the Vietnam era ever conducted, concluded that there was no compelling evidence that living American prisoners were knowingly abandoned in Southeast Asia after the 1973 Paris Peace Accords. But the investigation also documented extensive evidence of institutional failures, of intelligence reports that were not adequately followed up, of information from defectors and refugees that was not properly evaluated, and of bureaucratic processes within the Defense Intelligence Agency and other organizations that were more focused on managing the political dimensions of the POW and MIA issue than on resolving individual cases. The intelligence record on the POW and MIA question includes hundreds of reports from Vietnamese defectors, refugees, and in-country sources that described live American prisoners being held at various times after the official prisoner exchanges of 1973. Most of these reports were evaluated as unreliable. Some of them were evaluated and then not properly documented. The Defense Intelligence Agency's internal processes for handling live sighting reports, as examined by the Senate Committee, were found to be inadequate in ways that ranged from bureaucratic carelessness to what the committee diplomatically described as a lack of analytical rigor. The political dimensions of the POW and MIA issue were managed with a degree of institutional sophistication that made the actual intelligence question almost secondary. The Nixon administration had strong incentives to declare the prisoner issue resolved as quickly as possible, because unresolved questions about living prisoners would have complicated the normalization of relations with North Vietnam and would have maintained a political pressure that the administration wanted to remove. The families of those listed as missing had strong incentives to believe their relatives were alive, because belief offered a form of hope that official declarations of death foreclosed. The political infrastructure that grew up around the POW and MIA issue, the organizations, the political advocates, the legislative frameworks, served institutional functions that were sometimes in tension with the actual intelligence analysis. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the handling of the POW and MIA question by successive American administrations from Nixon through Reagan was characterized by information management practices that prioritized political outcomes over transparency, that the intelligence apparatus did not always serve the families of the missing with the diligence that the situation required, and that the institutional culture within the relevant agencies around this question was shaped by an understanding that the political stakes were high enough that accuracy was sometimes subordinate to manageability. The financial dimensions of the Vietnam War, and specifically the ways in which the war's costs were hidden from the American public, constitute another area of institutional deception that has received less attention than the operational secrets, but that had consequences that extended decades beyond the war itself. The Johnson administration made a deliberate decision not to raise taxes to finance the war, choosing instead to use deficit spending in a way that concealed the war's true fiscal cost from the public and from Congress. The decision was made partly for political reasons, because Johnson feared that a tax increase to finance an unpopular war would threaten his Great Society domestic programs, and partly because economic advisors believed that the war would be shorter than it proved to be. The inflationary consequences of deficit financing the Vietnam War contributed substantially to the economic instability of the late 1960s and 1970s, including the breakdown of the Bretton Woods International Monetary System in 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, ending the direct convertibility of the dollar to gold that had been the foundation of the post-war international financial order. The connection between the fiscal decisions made to hide the true cost of the Vietnam War and the broader economic dislocations of that era was understood by economists at the time, but was not communicated clearly to the public. The internal debates within the Johnson administration about war financing, as revealed in declassified documents and the memoirs of participants, show that the decision to avoid a tax increase was made with a clear understanding of the inflationary risks. Treasury Secretary Henry Fowler and Federal Reserve Chairman William Martin both warned Johnson that deficit financing of the war would produce inflation. Johnson chose the deficit path anyway, and then spent years pressuring the Federal Reserve not to raise interest rates in ways that would have dampened the inflation but also would have dampened the economy before the 1968 election. The degree to which the Vietnam War's financial costs were deliberately obscured from Congress and the public, and the degree to which the economic consequences of that obscuring were borne not by the men who made those decisions but by ordinary Americans over the following decade, is a dimension of the war's legacy that rarely appears in the standard historical accounts. It belongs there. The question of drug use among American troops in Vietnam and the institutional response to it is another area where the gap between public statement and internal knowledge was extensive. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, drug use among American soldiers in Vietnam was widespread. Heroin, which was readily available in Vietnam at extremely low prices due to the region's proximity to the Golden Triangle opium-producing areas, was used by a substantial percentage of American soldiers. The Department of Defense's own studies from the early 1970s found that somewhere between 10 and 15% of American soldiers in Vietnam had used heroin at some point during their tour. The military's institutional response to the drug problem was initially to deny it. Press briefings described drug use as a minor problem that was being addressed through existing disciplinary channels. Commanders who reported high rates of drug use in their units were seen as failing to maintain discipline. The incentive structure once again was to underreport rather than to accurately characterize the situation. When the scale of the problem became impossible to deny, the institutional response shifted to treatment and testing programs, but the treatment capacity was inadequate for the scale of the problem, and the testing programs created new forms of institutional dysfunction. Soldiers who tested positive for heroin were subject to administrative action, which created an incentive to use heroin only at the beginning of a tour, when there was sufficient time for the drug to clear before any testing, a behavioral adaptation that was well understood within the user community, and that was documented in internal military studies. The connection between the heroin availability in Vietnam and the activities of certain factions within the South Vietnamese government and military, and potentially the activities of the CIA's Air America operation in Laos, which transported opium from the Hmong Highlands, is an area where the evidentiary record is complex and contested. Alfred McCoy's 1972 book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, documented extensive connections between the CIA, the French intelligence service, and the Southeast Asian drug trade, and the CIA attempted to prevent publication of the book. The institutional reflex to suppress scholarship that documented potentially embarrassing connections between American intelligence operations and the drug trade that was simultaneously addicting American soldiers is itself a piece of data about how the institution managed inconvenient information. The mutiny and fragging incidents that occurred during the later years of the war represent a dimension of military dysfunction that was actively suppressed in official communications and that has never been fully integrated into the public understanding of the Vietnam War. Fragging refers to the killing or attempted killing of officers and non-commissioned officers by their own troops, typically using fragmentation grenades, which leave little evidentiary trace. The term entered military vocabulary during the Vietnam War because the practice, while not entirely unknown in previous conflicts, reached a scale and frequency during Vietnam that made it a significant operational concern. The Department of Defense acknowledged in congressional testimony in 1971 that there had been approximately 333 confirmed fragging incidents since 1969, resulting in approximately 70 deaths. But the investigators who examined the fragging phenomenon, including those working inside military channels, understood that the confirmed incidents represented a significant undercount. Many incidents were listed as accidental deaths or as deaths under unclear circumstances. The incentive for unit commanders to accurately report fragging incidents was low, because such a report was an admission that discipline within the unit had broken down to the point of lethal insubordination. The fragging incidents were not random or inexplicable. They were concentrated in certain types of units and certain types of operational situations. They were most common in rear echelon units with high rates of drug use and racial tension. They were most common in situations where officers were ordering troops into operations that the troops believed to be unnecessarily dangerous and strategically pointless. They were most common in the later years of the war, after the announcement of Vietnamization, when American soldiers understood that they were being asked to continue fighting and dying in a war that their government had already decided could not be won, in order to maintain political optics during a withdrawal that was already in progress. The fragging phenomenon is a measure of the degree to which the institutional contract between the American military and its soldiers had broken down by the early 1970s. The soldiers who killed their officers were not the primary authors of that breakdown. They were responding to an institutional situation that had been created by decisions made far above them in the chain of command, decisions that had placed them in an impossible tactical and moral position, and the way the military managed that situation institutionally was to treat the fragging incidents as disciplinary problems rather than as symptoms of a systemic institutional failure. The treatment of Vietnamese civilians under the rules of engagement and the gap between the formal rules and the operational reality is one of the most extensively documented and least officially acknowledged dimensions of the war. The formal rules of engagement governing American forces in Vietnam were revised multiple times throughout the war, and they nominally required that civilian casualties be minimized, that targets be identified before engagement, and that proportionality be observed in the use of force. The operational reality in many areas of Vietnam was substantially different. The designation of free fire zones, areas in which anything that moved could be treated as hostile and killed without further identification, was an operational practice that was widespread throughout the war. The zones were designated by military commanders at various levels, and they effectively suspended the identification requirement of the formal rules of engagement. The legal and ethical implications of free fire zone designations were understood by some lawyers and policymakers within the system, but they were not a subject of public discussion, and they were not systematically reviewed or controlled at the highest levels of command. The air war's application to free fire zones, particularly through the use of tactical airstrikes, artillery, and the AC-47 and AC-130 gunship aircraft, resulted in civilian casualties at a scale that was never systematically counted or acknowledged. The operational reporting system counted Viet Cong killed in action, but had no parallel system for counting civilians killed by American fire. In many cases, civilians killed in free fire zones or by misdirected airstrikes were counted as enemy combatants, which served the body count metric while eliminating any record of civilian death from the operational data. The investigation of civilian casualties in the war was conducted internally by military investigators who were subordinate to the same chain of command that had authorized the operations that caused the casualties. The results of those investigations were classified. The families of Vietnamese civilians killed by American forces had no legal recourse and no access to the investigative process. The South Vietnamese government, which was theoretically the government of the people being killed, had no independent capacity to investigate American military operations and was dependent on American support for its survival in a way that foreclosed any serious diplomatic pressure on the issue. The estimates of total Vietnamese civilian casualties during the war range from 600,000 to 2 million, depending on the methodology and the scope of the conflict considered. No American official has ever been held criminally responsible for civilian deaths in Vietnam, with the limited exception of William Calley's conviction and subsequent effective non-punishment for My Lai. The institutional framework that produced those deaths, the free fire zones, the body count metrics, the inadequate rules of engagement, the reporting systems that rendered civilian deaths invisible, was never formally adjudicated or officially acknowledged. The role of the National Security Agency in the Vietnam War, and specifically the NSA's management of signals intelligence, represents one of the most thoroughly sealed chapters of the conflict's institutional history. The NSA's contribution to the war effort was enormous in volume and deeply problematic in application. The agency was responsible for intercepting communications from North Vietnamese military forces, from the Viet Cong infrastructure, and from a range of other targets, and for processing that intelligence into a form that could be used by operational commanders. The NSA's internal history of the Gulf of Tonkin incidents, which was partially declassified in 2005 and more fully released in 2007, is the most detailed example of how the agency's intelligence was selectively used to support policy conclusions that the raw intelligence did not support. But the Gulf of Tonkin history is only the most visible instance of a pattern that intelligence scholars have identified throughout the agency's involvement in Vietnam. Signals intelligence was difficult for operational commanders to use directly, required sophisticated interpretation, and carried classification restrictions that prevented it from being distributed widely. The result was that the intelligence was often filtered through analytical layers that reflected the institutional biases of those layers, and the conclusions that reached senior decision-makers were sometimes significantly at variance with what the underlying signals had actually shown. The NSA also conducted signals collection operations against American citizens and organizations during the Vietnam War as part of a program called Operation Minaret, which was revealed during the Church Committee hearings. Minaret collected communications of American citizens who were identified as persons of interest by various government agencies, including communications of individuals who were associated with the anti-war movement. The program operated without judicial authorization, without congressional knowledge, and in direct violation of the agency's charter, which restricted its activities to foreign intelligence collection. The list of American citizens whose communications were collected under Minaret included journalists, senators, civil rights leaders, and prominent anti-war figures. The discovery of Minaret was one of the central revelations of the Church Committee, and it contributed directly to the passage of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, which created a judicial framework for domestic intelligence collection. But the full scope of the NSA's domestic collection activities during the Vietnam era has never been disclosed. The records of what was collected, who was targeted, and what was done with the intelligence have been the subject of classification battles for decades. The NSA's position has consistently been that disclosing the details of Minaret and related programs would compromise methods and sources, a claim that has prevented the full institutional accounting that the scope of the program would seem to require. The domestic intelligence activities that the Vietnam War catalyzed were not limited to the NSA. The FBI's COINTELPRO program, which operated from 1956 through 1971, targeted domestic political organizations and individuals across the political spectrum, but with particular intensity against the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and the anti-war movement. COINTELPRO activities included the fabrication and planting of false documents to create distrust among organization members, the use of informants to disrupt organizing activities, and in some cases the facilitation of violence against targeted individuals. The connection between the Vietnam War and COINTELPRO was not incidental. The anti-war movement was one of COINTELPRO's principal targets. FBI field offices were directed to disrupt anti-war organizations, to identify and develop information on their members, and to use any available means to prevent those organizations from functioning effectively. The institutional premise was that opposition to the Vietnam War, expressed through legal political activity, was itself a national security threat that justified extraordinary countermeasures by the federal government against its own citizens. The COINTELPRO documents were disclosed in 1971 when a group of activists broke into an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, and removed files that they subsequently released to journalists. The Bureau had no classified status defense once the documents were in the hands of reporters who were prepared to publish them. and the revelations led eventually to the Church Committee investigation and to formal changes in the FBI's operating authorities. But the full scope of COINTELPRO, including the identities of all informants, all targets, and all operations, remains substantially classified. The FBI's position has been that disclosing that information would endanger informants, a claim that has effectively prevented the historical accounting that the program's scope and methods would otherwise require. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 ended direct American military involvement in Vietnam, but the story of how those accords came to be signed, and specifically the story of the secret negotiations that preceded them, contains one of the most significant instances of deliberate sabotage of a peace process in modern American diplomatic history. The sabotage did not occur in 1973. It occurred in 1968. In the fall of 1968, the Johnson administration was close to a breakthrough in peace negotiations with North Vietnam. The North Vietnamese had agreed to allow South Vietnam to participate in the Paris talks, which had been a Central American demand in exchange for an American halt to the bombing of North Vietnam. Johnson announced the bombing halt on October 31, 1968, 4 days before the presidential election, in an announcement that could have significantly benefited the Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey. Between the announcement of the bombing halt and the presidential election, the South Vietnamese government of Nguyen Van Thieu abruptly withdrew its agreement to participate in the Paris talks, announcing that the terms were unacceptable. The withdrawal effectively collapsed the peace initiative that had been building through months of secret negotiations. Without South Vietnamese participation, the talks could not proceed on the terms that had been arranged. The mechanism by which this collapse was engineered involved a channel of communication between the Nixon campaign and the South Vietnamese government, facilitated by Anna Chenol, a Chinese-American Republican fundraiser and well-connected figure in the Asian anti-communist political world. Chenol communicated to South Vietnamese Ambassador Bui Diem that if Thieu held out from the peace talks until after the election, a Nixon administration would give South Vietnam better terms than a Humphrey administration committed to Johnson's negotiating framework. This communication constituted at minimum an unauthorized private diplomatic intervention by a presidential campaign in active peace negotiations, and at maximum something that could be described as treason under a broad interpretation of the Logan Act, which prohibits private citizens from conducting unauthorized negotiations with foreign governments. The FBI was monitoring Chenot and knew about the communications. Johnson knew about it. Johnson's national security advisor, Walt Rostow, documented it in a memorandum. Johnson chose not to make the information public because he believed that doing so would expose the intelligence methods that had captured the communications, and because he judged that the political fallout from the revelation would be destructive in ways that went beyond any single election. Nixon won the election. The peace talks were delayed. The war continued for more than 4 years after the bombing halt that should have started the process of ending it. The additional American deaths during those 4 years, roughly 20,000 soldiers, died in a war whose continuation had been engineered in part to serve the electoral interests of one of the candidates seeking to inherit it. Rostow's memorandum documenting Johnson's knowledge of the Chenot affair was sealed in the Johnson Library under Rostow's instructions and was not opened until 1994, more than 20 years after the war ended. By that time, almost everyone principally involved was either dead or beyond any practical accountability. The question of what Nixon knew about the Chenot affair and when he knew it, and whether he personally authorized the communication or simply benefited from it without formal authorization, remains historically contested. What is not contested is that the communication happened, that it was intended to influence South Vietnamese behavior in a way that would affect the peace negotiations and the American election, and that it succeeded in both of those goals. The Watergate scandal, which ultimately ended the Nixon presidency, had direct connections to the Vietnam War that go beyond the political climate of the period. Several of the operatives involved in the Watergate break-in and related activities were veterans of covert operations run during the Vietnam War, including CIA officers and contractors who had been involved in operations in Southeast Asia and Cuba. The institutional skills that made them useful for covert political operations, the ability to conduct surveillance, to break into secure locations, to manage disinformation, had been developed and refined in the service of wartime intelligence operations. E. Howard Hunt, one of the central figures in the Watergate conspiracy, was a longtime CIA officer who had been involved in a range of covert operations going back to the 1950s. James McCord, another central figure, was a former CIA officer. G. Gordon Liddy, who ran the intelligence operations for the Nixon White House, had developed operational concepts that drew explicitly on techniques used by intelligence agencies. The Plumbers Unit, which the Nixon White House formed to stop leaks after the Pentagon Papers publication, was modeled explicitly on the kinds of covert internal security operations that American intelligence had developed for use in foreign contexts and was now deploying against American citizens and political opponents. The direct connection between the institutional practices developed during the Vietnam War era, the tolerance for covert action, the willingness to operate outside legal constraints in the service of national security objectives, and the abuses that eventually brought down the Nixon administration is one of the most structurally important but least acknowledged dimensions of the war's domestic legacy. The skills and the institutional habits that made Watergate possible were not invented for domestic political purposes. They were adapted from practices that had been normalized in the service of the war. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 and the final evacuation of American personnel and some South Vietnamese allies was not simply the end of a war. It was the end of an institutional project that had consumed billions of dollars, tens of thousands of American lives, perhaps 2 million Vietnamese lives, and the institutional credibility of several American governmental agencies. The way that end was managed, and specifically the way information about the final days of the war was controlled, is itself a piece of the institutional history. The CIA station in Saigon, which was one of the largest in the world at its peak, was responsible for the agency's network of South Vietnamese agents, informants, and collaborators. Thousands of people who had worked with the CIA under the explicit or implicit understanding that their relationship with the agency offered them some form of protection. In the final days before the fall, the agency evacuated a portion of its personnel and some of its Vietnamese contacts. Many were left behind. The lists of who was evacuated and who was left, and the reasoning behind those decisions, were classified and have remained substantially protected from public disclosure. The South Vietnamese employees of the American Embassy, the employees of USAID, the employees of the dozens of American organizations that had operated throughout South Vietnam, the individuals who had worked with American intelligence in whatever capacity, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The evacuation capacity was inadequate for that number under any circumstances, and the evacuation was further constrained by the chaotic security situation in the final days. But the decisions about who was a priority, who had been given explicit promises of evacuation, and who was left to face whatever came after the North Vietnamese takeover, were decisions that were made with full knowledge of the consequences and that have been protected from full public accounting ever since. The intelligence analysis that preceded the fall of Saigon, and specifically the question of whether the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency provided adequate warning of how quickly the South Vietnamese military would collapse, is another piece of the institutional record that was managed carefully in the aftermath. The official position was that the speed of the collapse surprised the intelligence community. The internal records, portions of which have been declassified over the years, suggest a more complicated picture, one in which some analysts were providing accurate assessments of South Vietnamese military fragility that were not being communicated to policymakers in ways that would have forced earlier decisions about the evacuation. The post-Vietnam syndrome, as it came to be called, the reluctance of American military and political institutions to commit to long-term military operations without clear objectives and exit strategies, was a real institutional consequence of the war. but it was also, in some respects, a managed narrative. The lessons that were drawn from Vietnam within the military establishment were not primarily lessons about the limits of military force or the political dynamics of counterinsurgency. They were primarily lessons about the political management of military operations, about public support, about media access, about the importance of controlling the information environment. The Weinberger Doctrine, articulated by Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger in 1984, and the Powell Doctrine that evolved from it, established criteria for the commitment of American military force that were designed explicitly to prevent a recurrence of the Vietnam experience. Those criteria included the requirement for clear objectives, adequate forces, viable exit strategies, and public support. What those criteria did not address, and what has never been formally addressed in any institutional doctrine, was the question of honest accounting. The doctrines focused on the conditions for committing force. They said nothing about the obligation to accurately represent what that force was doing once committed. The institutional culture of information management that the Vietnam War both revealed and reinforced persisted in the American military and intelligence establishment long after the war ended. The classified operational reporting systems, the distinction between what was said publicly and what was known privately, the management of casualty data, the handling of programs that could not survive public scrutiny, these institutional habits did not disappear when the last American personnel left Saigon. They were carried forward, refined, and applied to the next set of challenges. The veterans who came home from Vietnam carried a version of this institutional dynamic in their own bodies and minds. Many of them knew things that they had been told not to talk about, that would not have been believed if they had talked about them, or that they had no framework for communicating to a public that had already formed its understanding of what the war had been. The veterans who witnessed operations that were never officially acknowledged, who participated in programs that were classified, who killed people who were counted in ways that bore no relationship to the reality of what had happened, came home to a country that was trying to forget the war rather than understand it. The process of historical declassification has proceeded slowly and unevenly. The most sensitive categories of Vietnam-era documents remain classified or have been declassified in heavily redacted form. The CIA's operational records from the period are among the most protected. The NSA's full records of signals collection operations remain substantially sealed. The records of certain special operations units that operated in Laos and Cambodia are accessible only in fragmentary form. The full picture of what the American government did in Southeast Asia and what it knew while it was doing it remains assembled only in partial form, scattered across multiple archives, some of them inaccessible, some of them destroyed. The destruction of records is itself part of the institutional history. The CIA's drug operations files from the early 1970s were destroyed under the direction of CIA Director Richard Helms in January 1973, 2 days after Watergate burglar James McCord wrote to Judge John Sirica offering to provide information about the break-in. The destruction of those files, known as the Family Jewels destruction, removed from the historical record a set of documents that documented the CIA's most sensitive and legally problematic covert operations. The Family Jewels Summary, a document that described what had been in the destroyed files, was itself classified until 2007. The Joint Personnel Recovery Agency and its predecessors, the organizations responsible for accounting for American prisoners and missing in action, maintained records of the resolution of individual cases that were often kept from the families of the missing. The criteria for declaring a case resolved, for changing a status from missing in action to presumed killed in action, were applied in ways that served the administrative convenience of the Department of Defense, rather than the informational needs of the families. The families who spent decades fighting for information about what had happened to their relatives, families who in many cases were given false assurances or inadequate explanations, experienced on a personal scale the same institutional management of information that defined the war itself. The academic historians and investigative journalists who have spent careers working through the Vietnam-era record have produced a body of scholarship that is considerably more detailed and more damning than the official historical accounts. But even that scholarship is limited by what has been made available and by the institutional habits of the organizations that maintain the remaining sealed records. The process of declassification in the United States is governed by policies that were themselves shaped by the experience of Vietnam, by the institutional determination of the national security agencies not to allow another situation in which classified operational records could be disclosed in ways that would embarrass or constrain the agencies. The Vietnam War ended for the United States in April 1975. The systems that sustained it, the classified operational frameworks, the institutional habits of information management, the covert programs, the special authorities, the tolerance for conducting military operations without public accountability, did not end with it. They were adapted and carried forward, and they continue to shape the institutional behavior of the American national security establishment in ways that the Vietnam experience made visible, if only briefly, to the people who were paying attention. The war cost approximately 58,000 American lives. It cost somewhere between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese lives, a range that reflects the institutional unwillingness to count the dead with precision. It cost the equivalent of roughly $1 trillion in 2020 values, though the full cost, including veterans' benefits paid over the subsequent decades, is considerably higher. It produced institutional damage to the American military, intelligence community, and the relationship between the American government and its citizens that took decades to partially repair, and that has never been fully assessed. The men who designed the systems that produced those costs, who maintained the information environments that prevented accountability, who made the decisions in classified rooms with knowledge that was never shared with the Congress that authorized the war or the public that funded it, retired to prestigious positions, wrote their memoirs, gave interviews, and died at comfortable ages, having never been formally called to account for what the institutional record shows they knew, and when they knew it. The classified portions of that record remain sealed. The organizations that sealed them continue to exist. The authorities under which they were sealed continue to operate. The war ended. The systems did not.